But the electricity system will have to be transformed. And that will involve enormous changes to investment patterns, workforce training and skills, and cultural attitudes too, and understanding of how we supply and use energy. Electricity will cost more, but it actually won't be more than it now costs in most of Europe, in Japan, and in many parts of the USA. The whole object of having higher electricity prices is to bring about structural change in the economy, to actually get some of those industries that use a lot of electricity maybe to form a smaller part, to be just actually to shrink, to lose out. That's actually a necessary part of the process coming through, because consumers will buy less ultimately of those products because they'll cost more. Move towards a structure that has inherently lower greenhouse gas emissions. That won't be catastrophic to the economy, but even though you hear a lot of loud lobbying saying that it will be. And if we succeed in transforming our electricity system, I think the new system will be far more diverse, more geographically dispersed. That will make it less vulnerable to disruptions by storms, fires, floods and other natural events, but also less vulnerable to malicious human attack. And it will therefore provide greater energy security in terms of physical supply of electricity is concerned.
I'm hoping today to not in any way repeat what Hugh has said. Hugh's paper is very learned and will be there as a permanent record. I'm simply here to try and trigger your responses or to get your minds running about what your part might be in energy security. If there was a blockade of Australia, not impossible, would the lights go out or could we keep them working? Fundamentally, there's a very close mix, and the first dot point I've got there, between the technology scenarios ahead, and Hugh has touched on a number of those, and Hugh concluded by saying, and I share his view, that those scenarios that you, and certainly the younger of you amongst you, are going to see will be extraordinarily different from the central, almost the central command economy structure, the paradigm that we have to this day, and which, as Hugh has told us, is to some extent enshrined in the law and regulations as a continuum. Those things will change, politically and realistically, they will change. But security is tied up enormously with one of the other great challenges of today, and I share Hugh's view. I happen to believe the scientists, at least I'm not strong enough to disbelieve the scientists, and I think the precautionary principle is something that we cannot do without. But, as I'll come to in a later slide, I think if we do adopt some of the things that, and the great reductions with various market and other incentives in the amount of energy used, we'll in fact have a much nicer world to live in. There's no way we can continue on as we are now, although I'm certainly doing precious little about it. I turn on the heating in my home because I don't get too many signals to tell me not to. Renewables have enormous potential, and there's a lot of research work we can do. Solar energy, well, most of you know all this, but the rooftop photovoltaic, I think will be, which is now a bit peculiar, wealthy people have it, it's a bit strange, it's a very novel thing you talk about at dinner parties. I think that will be standard technology in 20 years' time. Roofs will not be made of bricks and mortar. There'll be mini power stations of 2 to 3 or maybe 4 or 5 kilowatts interconnected with the system. That's all I'll say on that slide. This is where it's all coming from, and that all means every single one of you, not just the government, it's all of you. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Left on me to say. But I guess as a final respondent, I would like to take a slightly different, albeit entirely complementary approach to that Hugh and Martin have already done. And I guess I'd like to begin by trying to extend the classical definition that Hugh gave us when he set the scene so comprehensively, and that is to acknowledge that energy supply and consumption, regardless of the technologies that we choose, and all of those technologies were fairly comprehensively outlined by Martin, of course, must be balanced against other key issues as part of our thoughts about security. So what other issues there do we need to think about? Well, the two main ones, and of course there are others that you could also add to that Venn diagram that I've got on the left of the screen there, are of course environmental issues, the waste that we generate, for example, and societal issues. What compromises are we as a society willing to make? Now, in the environmental context, I would sound a warning to the effect that we must not just think about the impacts of the energy generation itself, but in fact take an all-of-life perspective to assessing our energy generation scenarios. And in fact, thinking about sustainability and security requires us to think about the impact of building energy generating infrastructure as well as dealing with the wastes that energy generation process itself leads to. Now, in the next few slides, I'd like to take a look at some of the consumption issues from the perspective of 5 countries that are clearly shown on the map there. Australia, for obvious reasons, to locate us in the world. The United States, which, as you can see there, and as many of us probably believe, is a rather heavy consumer of energy and energy resources. Japan, France, and China. And China in particular, because it's one of the upcoming powerhouses that we all note and take note of every time we look at the newspapers. Okay, well, let's begin by comparing how our usage of energy has evolved over the past 25 years on a per capita basis for every man, woman and child in the country. Now, historically, the USA has been the biggest per capita user of energy, due largely to their extensive and much used transportation infrastructure, and I'll show that towards the end of the talk. However, I think we'd have to say that Australians are rapidly catching up, as you can see by the green trace there. And these plots suggest that we actually run the very real risk of overtaking the United States in the race to become the highest per capita users of energy, if you can believe those numbers. Now, by far the lowest here is China, although we can see that they are also starting to ramp up. Okay, well, let's move away from those raw numbers and take a closer look at some of the technologies that Martin was talking about that we use to generate electricity. Now, electricity generation is by no means the biggest producer of greenhouse gases, but indeed it is a very important part of that waste mix. And this plot here summarises the amount of CO2 generated per kilowatt hour of power generated as a function of a selection of various technologies, including non-renewables and also some of the renewables that Martin mentioned as well. Now, in my penultimate slide, I'd just like to have a quick look at how our usages of energy are predicted to scale over the next 20 to 30 years. Indeed, Hugh has gone into this in much more detail than I've gone here. But suffice it to say that the big players in this game are still predicted to be China and the USA into the future, and Australia is predicted to be really a long way down in that particular scenario. It's interesting, but to look at how the various nations are using that power. And whereas most of us have most of our energy being consumed in industrial, heavy industries, as you can see in the cases of China, Japan and Australia there, transportation is currently and is predicted to remain the major use of energy in the United States. So in that sense, the United States is a little bit different and special than the rest of us. Well, I'd like to conclude just by reminding us what we're all worried about when we're talking about energy security and all of the issues surrounding energy generation. Now, Martin mentioned in one of his slides the fact that we're all after a much nicer world through our considering energy security and the various ways in which we go about generating energy. Now, as evidenced by the slide we've got here, which looks at both a built environment on the left and natural environment on the left, I happen to think that we already, in so many ways, live in a pretty nice world. And the challenge is to find ways to keep it that way, or if possible, to improve it. So I'd like to leave it there. Thank you very much.
So in closing, this is the first of 5. Go out and buy your tickets. Make sure you get seats for the next one, which is going to be a bit of a buzz, I think. We've got petroleum and fossil fuels with Dr. Beverly Ronalds from CSIRO, head of the petroleum group and group executive. Ian Dunlop from who's actually going to be speaking about peak oil and gas, which terrified me when I spoke to him on the phone. So if you like horror movies, this is the one. And finally, Dr. Alan Lowe, who's the chief technologist with the Cooperative Research Centre for Coal and Sustainable Development. So it's going to be a very, very good episode, that one.